No Bad Parts: Healing Trauma and Restoring Wholeness with the Internal Family Systems Model. It was written by Richard C. Schwartz, PhD, read by Sen Naomi Kirst-Schultz. We are on Chapter 6, Healing and Transformation. What do we mean by healing and transformation in IFS? As I stated earlier, our culture in general, and psychotherapy specifically, have made the terrible mistake of assuming that parts are the way they seem. That is, the part that gets you to eat too much is simply a binge impulse, or the ones that make you shake in terror is just a panic attack, and that's all they are: destructive impulses, emotions, thought patterns, or mental diseases. When you understand that you are not sick or defective, and instead see that you merely have a part playing an extreme role, you will feel relieved and comforted. Families are like this too. For example, the literature on alcoholic families and the sibling roles kids are thrust into by the dynamics of their family often refers to the lost child, hero, and scapegoat roles. But these roles don't have anything to do with the essence of that particular child. If a good therapist came in and reorganized the family, the child would be released from their role and relax into who they really are. I'm contending that it's the same with internal families. Parts are thrust into given roles and they long to be released from them. Once they are free, they transform. If you were raised in a perfectly harmonious family in a perfectly harmonious culture, you wouldn't have parts in these roles. In fact, you would hardly notice your parts because they would be working together, caring about each other and feeling connected to yourself. In other words, your inner system would be in harmony. Some people do have many parts that were never burdened, parts that are still in their naturally valuable states. We therapists don't tend to work with people like this because they don't especially benefit from therapy. Instead, we usually work with the burdened parts of people that are attached to the problems they bring to us. Recall the 4 goals of IFS: to liberate parts from their roles and return them to their natural states, to restore trust in the self, to reharmonize the inner system, and to become self-led. What we call healing in this work is crucial to achieving these goals because burdened exiles will keep us feeling vulnerable, anxious, worthless, ashamed, lonely, and empty. And all of that will continue to drive our protectors. Originally, the word heal meant to make whole or to save. When we heal any level of a human system, we bring its scattered or polarized members back into harmony so as to make the system whole again. The members of healed families or companies do not disappear. Instead, they reconnect and harmonize. The same is true of internal families. An exile is healed when self retrieves it from where it is stuck in the past. Then the exile can unburden and begin to reintegrate with all the other parts in the system. When that happens, the system feels far less vulnerable, and protectors also feel freed up to unburden and take on new valuable roles. Thus, all the protective energy that went into keeping you from being triggered and keeping your exiles at bay is freed up for healthier endeavors, and you have new access to the wonderful feelings and resources of your healed former exiles. Here's a summary of one session with a client to illustrate. Cheryl came to see me shortly after her boyfriend had asked her to marry him. Her immediate reaction to his proposal was terror, and she couldn't understand what that was about, because she really loved him. They'd been together for a long time, and she knew him very well. She was now doubting herself, thinking maybe her intuition was seeing something that she didn't. She was debating whether to pull out and was in a lot of distress about it. I invited Cheryl to focus on that fear and get to know it. She found the terror in her gut, and when I asked how she felt toward it, she said she was very afraid of it and didn't want to hear from it. I asked her to see if those parts could give us a little space to get to know it for a few minutes. They agreed, as long as they would also have a voice afterward. Cheryl now said she was curious about the fear and asked it why it was so terrified. The fear ultimately showed her scenes of herself as a little girl when she felt trapped by her alcoholic father who was physically abusing her, memories she was aware of but had minimized the impact of. It turned out that the terror was a protector who made a quote-unquote never again decision during that time. It would never again let that little girl, the exile it protected, get into that kind of position. As Cheryl listened to the fear, it began to relax, and I had her ask if we had its permission to go to the little girl and heal her. The protector said it would stay nearby and watch because it was skeptical, but would let her try. I then asked Cheryl how she felt toward that little girl. She began crying and said she felt so sorry for her. I told her to get close to the girl and show her she had that compassion for her. The girl welcomed her attention and Cheryl hugged the girl. Cheryl then asked the girl to let her know how bad it was with the father, and the girl not only showed her scenes of the abuse, but also had Cheryl feel the intense anxiety and betrayal that she constantly felt back then. Once that exiled little girl felt fully witnessed, Cheryl entered that time period, and while the girl watched, told the father to never touch the girl again. Then she took the girl out of that time period to the house she currently lived in, and assured her that she never had to go back to that time, and that Cheryl would be taking care of her now. Once she trusted that, the little girl was willing to unload all the anxiety, sense of powerlessness, and trapped feelings. The girl decided to send all that out of her and into light. She then invited a sense of safety and being lovable into her body. Next, we invited the terror-based protector to come and see the girl to see that it didn't have to protect her anymore. The protector was impressed and happy to see that, but it wasn't quite ready to unburden its terror. Protectors carry burdens too. Because it still protected other exiles that we hadn't met yet. Ultimately, we healed those exiles too. Cheryl married her boyfriend, and last I heard, they're doing fine. So, this is an example of the healing process in IFS. I present this summary here to illustrate some of what you have started experiencing in the exercises so far. With Cheryl, I quickly went to her exile. We haven't done that so far, and we won't in this book. As I mentioned before, working with exiles directly can be delicate when you are by yourself. You can, however, begin to ask and learn about the exiles that are driving your protectors, and then maybe go to those exiles with the help of a trained IFS therapist or with someone who you trust can stay in self with you and not get triggered if you show a lot of emotion. Exiles need you to connect with them until they trust you. Then they need you to witness what happened to them and know how truly bad it was. Then you can go back to where they are stuck in the past and bring them out. At that point, they are usually willing to unburden the beliefs and emotions they've been carrying. When you show them that they don't need to protect their exiles anymore, protectors will sometimes panic. They think you're going to downsize them. They've been at the same job for decades. I've learned to simply ask them, "What do you want to do now?" Because they all have a natural desire to do something productive inside of you, and as I said earlier, you can't really predict what that's going to be. A lot of managers become advisors, so the part who's been scanning for danger constantly now wants to just be discerning and whisper to you sometimes when you go into a new situation. Others want to do the opposite of the role they've been in. The critic becomes your biggest fan. The one who kept you invisible now wants to help you shine. Exercise. The path. Since this part of the book is focused on self-leadership, I want to offer you a practice to give you more of a felt sense of yourself and self-energy. Again, get comfortable and take deep breaths if that helps. And in your mind's eye, put yourself at the base of a path. It could be one you've already been on, or it could be a path that's totally new to you. And then meet with your parts at the base of this path and ask them if they'd be willing to wait there for you and let you go on this brief journey by yourself for a little while. Notice how they react to that idea. You can try to see if those who are afraid could be comforted by those who aren't, and let them all know that you won't be gone long, and this would be good for them and for you, but they don't have to let you do it if they're not ready to. It just depends on the day. Some days they're okay with it, and some days they're not up for it, and that's natural. If they're not up for it, then don't do it. You can spend the time just getting to know them better and understand their fears about letting you try this. However, if they are up for it, then go ahead and head out on the path, reminding them that you'll be back soon. At different points, I'll pause and ask you to notice certain things as you go, but for now, just head out on the path. Now, I'm going to invite you to just notice what's happening as you continue on the path, and in particular, if you're thinking anything at all, because if you are thinking, that means there's still some parts with you. See if they too would be willing to separate and go back with the others. If not, what's their fear? You can also scan your body for anything that doesn't feel quite like you as yourself. If you find anything, that also is likely to be a part, and you can ask it to return to the base. If the parts you find are willing to return to the base, then you'll gradually notice yourself becoming more and more pure awareness, without a lot of thought. And if the parts aren't willing to leave you, that's fine. You can just spend the time getting to know their fears. If at any point you find yourself watching yourself taking this journey, that means there's a part trying to do it for you. Who is it that's watching? You can ask that part to go to the base too, so that as you're on the path, you don't see yourself, you see your surroundings in a direct, first-person sort of way. If your parts are really trusting you to do this, then by now you should be experiencing some of the qualities we've been talking about. Clarity, the absence of thought, spaciousness, present-centeredness, a sense of well-being, connectedness, being in your body, confidence, and so on. You may also sense a kind of vibrating energy running through your body. We call that self-energy. If you feel that energy, invite it to run throughout your body. If you notice any places where the energy can't flow, it's likely there is a part blocking it for some reason, so you can see if that part will go back to the base too. If you're not feeling some of these things, it means there are parts still with you, and you can scan your body and your mind to see if you can find those parts and ask if they will go back to the base. At some point, just pause and take in this experience. Notice what it's like to have this much self in your body. Notice the different ways you can feel it, as well as how and where self-energy manifests and reveals itself. It's important to remember these markers. That's how you can tell you are embodied. As you go through your day, you can tell how much you're there or not, how much your parts are running things. I often check how open my heart is, whether I'm in my head thinking a lot, or if there's pressure in my shoulders and my forehead, which is where my managers hang out. If I catch any of these parts at work, I just ask them to relax and, in a sense, go back to the base and watch while I handle whatever I'm facing. Just trust me, I tell them. Some of them need to give me some advice before they do step back, which is fine. If by now you are feeling a lot of this self-energy, a lot of embodiment, then you have the option of inviting any messages from the universe. Maybe nothing comes, and that's okay, but people will sometimes get some clear guidance at a point like this. Now I'm going to invite you to head back toward the base at whatever pace feels right, and when you get back to your parts, see how they react to your return and thank them for whatever risks they took to let you do this. Ask what it's been like for them. Check to see if they'll be up for letting you try it again sometime. Remind them once again that you can help them, that your goal is to earn their trust, and if any of them haven't trusted you for any reason, you're open to knowing about that and making repairs. And if you're still holding any tingling self-energy, you can extend it to your parts. You'll find that it's very healing and that you can actually direct it to your parts and to other people. I extend it to my clients when I'm working with them. If you're able to do this last piece, then just notice how your parts react to receiving the self-energy you have to offer them. And when all that feels complete, thank your parts once again for whatever portion of this exercise they allowed and begin shifting your focus back outside. But also see if you can hold some of this self state even as you open your eyes and come back. Some people don't get very far down the path. For one reason or another, their parts won't allow it. Even so, it's valuable to learn why. Ask them why they don't trust that it's safe, and work with their fears. However, if parts are willing to wait at the base and let you go down the path by yourself, pretty universally, people have some of the experiences I described. Self-energy arises spontaneously once your parts let you be fully embodied, and you can direct that energy to yourself or others as you choose. Personally, I don't extend it to people unless I know that it's welcome, but I do encourage you to extend it to parts whether or not they have agreed to it because they just seem to love it. At the point where I invited you to ask for any messages, it's not uncommon that nothing happens. That being said, sometimes people do receive clear guidance about their lives or about how to work with their parts. And sometimes it's just a kind of warmth, a comforting sense they're not alone. If you do receive some information at this point, share it with your parts. As far as where this information comes from, I don't really take a position on the issue. Whether it's your intuition, a wise part of yourself, some spirit guide, or whatever, I'll leave that up to you to discover for yourself. I'll just say that from the standpoint of empirical observation, when people are fully in self and ask for a message, something useful often comes. Another important aspect to this exercise is that it often forces you to notice parts that you wouldn't notice otherwise. We all have managers that are self-like or self-light. We don't typically detect them because they're so blended and involved in most of our interactions with the world. They often believe they are us, and we often believe that too, but they're just a really convincing kind of protector. They make us nice, polite, caring, for example, but only to persuade other people to like us and think we are good. And they're often the ones responsible for keeping certain parts they don't approve of exiled. Unlike the self, self-like managers have protective agendas and aren't fully authentic when they convey caring, gratitude, or respect. That's what some people derogatorily refer to as the ego, but they deserve our love rather than our disdain. Just like any other protector, we need to relieve them of their huge burdens of responsibility. Exercise. Accessing the self through unblending. Like the exercise you just did, this practice will help you explore how self operates inside of you. As you typically do to begin these exercises, take a second to get comfortable and breathe deeply, if you find that helpful. Again, we're going to check in with the parts that you are actively getting to know and just see how they're doing today. Remind them that you're there with them and that you can help them and that you care about them. You can also expand your purview to include other parts you might not know so well. Just extend a recognition that you know they're there, that you care for them, and that you plan to keep getting to know them. When you have the sense that your parts all feel at least recognized by you, ask them to relax and open up space in your mind and body. Assure them that it will be just for a little while, and that the purpose of this exercise is to let you and them know more of who you really are. If they are willing, again you'll notice the same experience of expanded and spacious awareness that you felt in the path exercise. This time, I want you to see if they'd be willing to let you hold this state we call self-leadership, even when you open your eyes. So, if your eyes have been closed up to now, just try opening them and see if you can feel the spaciousness. You might also find that when you open your eyes, parts jump back to attention to protect. The practice of opening your eyes in that state is one step in a process that can lead you to experience a sense of being self-led and embodied in your daily life. By quote-unquote practice, I don't mean that self-leadership is something you have to build up like a muscle. What we're doing in this exercise instead is just helping parts increase their trust so that they allow you to embody and lead, so that they learn to know that this is safe. The more they give it a try and see that nothing terrible happens, the more willing they'll be to keep giving it a try. More and more you can experience this other way of being and extend it to your daily life. At the end of this practice, remember to thank your parts for all they are doing and shift your focus back outside again. And also see how much you can hold this sense of self as you come back and go about your day. What the self is and what the self isn't. In the early days of developing IFS, I found that when I guided clients through these exercises and their parts would open space inside, they'd spontaneously shift into self. Furthermore, it was almost like the same person was emerging in different clients, so I began cataloging the qualities they would all manifest. And that's how I compiled the following list. The 8 C's of self-energy and self-leadership. Curiosity, calm, confidence, compassion, creativity, clarity, courage, and connectedness. Although there's no sequential order to these C's, I find that the first quality to reveal itself is often curiosity. You've probably noticed yourself becoming more curious about your parts in a new way in some of the practices you've done in this book. Compassion as a spontaneous aspect of self blew my mind because I'd always assumed and learned that compassion was something you had to develop. There's this idea, especially in some spiritual circles, that you have to build up the muscle of compassion over time, because it's not inherent. Again, that's the negative view of human nature at play. To be clear, what I mean by compassion is the ability to be in self with somebody when they're really hurting, and feel for them, but not be overwhelmed by their pain. You can only do that if you've done it within yourself. That is, if you can be with your own exiles without blending and being overwhelmed by them, and instead show them compassion and help them. Then, you can do the same for someone in pain who is sitting across from you. Of course, this also involves a notable degree of courage and calm. In self, you can better handle troubling people or situations that may have paralyzed you before, and you can also go into the inner caves and abysses that once terrified you. There's confidence in doing this, and creativity as well. Once in self, you enjoy a lot of clarity about what's going on in you and others, and this will enable you to come up with all sorts of solutions and out-of-the-box ideas. Also, when you experience self, you naturally feel more connected to humanity in general, and also to something larger and more encompassing. The earth, the universe, the big self, or whatever your experience of this is. In other words, once in self, you feel less isolated and lonely. Of course, all these qualities work together. When you get curious about a part, you naturally gain clarity regarding what it's all about, which typically results in a newfound compassion for all it's been through and is trying to do. Also, when people sense how connected they are to humanity, they feel more curious about others and have more courage to help them. In this way, even accessing one of these C qualities often leads to the appearance and activity of others. In IFS, we talk about starting with a critical mass of self, enough to get the ball rolling in a good direction, and the others will follow. That being said, it's rare for someone to be in a state of pure self in which all of these qualities manifest simultaneously, although the path exercise can sometimes get you fairly close. Most of the time, we're blended to some degree with different parts, but as you repeatedly prove to your parts they don't have to blend, you gradually experience more of the 8 C's, and more often as well. And you'll also discover other qualities rising up in you, things like joy, equanimity, forgiveness, perspective, and playfulness. The more you're familiar with these qualities, the more you'll be able to tell when you're in self and when you're not. I have a set of markers that I check as I go through my day, but I also find them particularly helpful during triggering times. For example, when I'm interacting with someone, I can quickly notice how open or closed my heart is, and how much compassion I have for them. I'll check to see if I have a big agenda for talking to them, or a tone of voice that's constrained or lacking energy. I can also just check for how many of the 8 C's I'm embodying. Different people have different markers, and I encourage you to find yours. Then, you can assume that any departures from those qualities are the activities of parts, and that will enable you to identify and remind them that it's safe for them to separate and trust you to handle the situation. And when they do trust you, suddenly you'll feel your heart open more, your voice shift, your vision clear, your breathing get deeper, and so on. I also want to say a little bit about what the self isn't. Mostly, I want to emphasize that the self is not what people typically consider the ego, which in IFS terms is a cluster of managers who are trying to run your life and keep you safe. The self also isn't your observing ego or witness consciousness, because it doesn't just passively watch. The self isn't content to just observe. It's not compassionate to passively watch suffering beings parade by. When you really access self, you naturally want to help your parts. Self is not observable. You can't see yourself because it's your seat of consciousness. It's the place from which you see your parts and the outside world. So if I asked you to hug a part of yourself, and your experience was one of watching yourself performing that action, that's not yourself. As I discussed in the path exercise, if you see yourself in the inner world, it's usually a self-like part, trying to run things for you because it doesn't trust that it's safe to let you do it. Some spiritual traditions teach that you can't really describe what the self is, that it's somehow ineffable. I don't find that to be true. I find that when people access self, they are characterized by the qualities we've been discussing, and they can palpably sense that they're there and other people can sense it in them. It's something quite real, as opposed to ethereal or indescribable. The self is indeed more than the sum of your parts. It's also in everyone, although it needs a certain amount of hardware, i.e., brain capacity, to operate fully. Young children can't fully access self, although they can embody enough self to heal themselves emotionally, a process witnessed and described by many IFS child therapists. Children don't have the brain power to fully protect themselves in the world, regardless of how much their parts might allow them to be self-led. And this is partly why your parts lost trust in your self's leadership when you were hurt as a young child. You couldn't protect them at the time, and they think they have to take over. When you realize that you're not the insecure, selfish parts that you've identified with for so long, but instead that you're this self that's curious, calm, confident, compassionate, creative, clear, courageous, joyful, generous, and playful, and that your essence is connected to some kind of larger universal principle, you feel happy. Spirituality and the self. I've already discussed the kinds of spiritualities that appeal to exiles, managers, and firefighters. What about the self? In short, the self has an inherent desire to create and facilitate balance, harmony, wholeness, and healing at all levels of a system. For a while now, I've been interested in the combination of IFS and psychedelic medicines because they seem to have the effect of quickly helping protector parts relax, such that people often have much more access to the self than normal. There have been a number of research projects demonstrating the benefits of psychedelics, some of which are described in Michael Pollan's popular book, How to Change Your Mind. I've been particularly interested in the use of MDMA in part because, unlike other psychedelics, when people take MDMA, they don't hallucinate or leave their bodies. Instead, they experience a sense of inner peace, joy, well-being, and a strong connection and compassion for others. In other words, they experience the same things I'd been discovering about the self. Notably, there's a current study, now in phase 3 trials, looking into how MDMA works with patients with PTSD, and the research is being spearheaded by Michael and Annie Mithofer, 2 well-trained IFS therapists. They don't practice IFS with subjects in the study unless they spontaneously begin to identify and work with a part. Instead, they just maintain a compassionate, non-directive presence and let the subjects go wherever they want. In an early study, the Mithofers found that 70% of the subjects spontaneously began working with their parts in a loving way without any prompting from them. This phenomenon would suggest that what happens in IFS is a natural process that we all know how to do when we are not bound up by protectors. In general, I find that self-led people are drawn to practices, rituals, and religious traditions that help them access more self and feel their connection to something grander and more universal. For example, what some call God, and what I refer to as self. They also choose spiritual paths that encourage them to bring connection, harmony, and healing to their parts, to other people, and to the planet. They frequently practice meditation, but only forms that do not denigrate or exile parts. Ideally, the meditation, mantra, chant, or mindfulness practice encourages separating from parts, soothes protectors, and allows self to enter the body so that a person can feel the sense of well-being, calm, and love that accompanies self-embodiment. When you access self through meditation, it's not just a pleasant way to spend 20 minutes. You're also demonstrating to your parts that it's beneficial for them to separate because they will feel your warm presence in your body, which will reassure them and helps them trust you more. You also get a deeper felt sense of what it's like to more fully access yourself. As you go through the day, you can notice how much you are in that state or not. And if you aren't, you can remind your parts to open space and let you back. With certain kinds of meditation, you can also enter into the non-dual state, that boundaryless experience of oneness in which you lose a sense of being separate and meld with something oceanic. I've had personal experience with this state, both in meditation and with the psychedelic ketamine, and it's always profound. I return with a greater sense of there being much more to the universe than our senses allow us to experience, as well as increased compassion for how difficult this earth plane can be, coupled with a commitment to make it better. Quantum physics tells us that a photon is both a particle and a wave. I believe the same is true for the self. Most of the time we experience self in its particle state. We feel some degree of connectedness to others and self, while also sensing that we are separate entities with boundaries and individual agency. Through meditation or psychedelics, however, we can lose those boundaries and enter the wave state. We become part of the much larger field of self, or, all caps, self, in a way that feels numinous. Actually, physics is increasingly recognizing this odd phenomenon that everything is simultaneously both particle and wave. There is a growing recognition that everything that seems solid is in fact part of a vibrating field. As leading theoretical physicist Sean Carroll says, quote, "To understand what is going on, you actually need to give up a little bit on the notion of particles," unquote. He suggests instead that we think of fields. We already know about magnetic or gravitational fields, but as Carroll points out, quote, the universe is full of fields, and what we think of as particles are just excitations of those fields, like waves in an ocean. An electron, for example, is just an excitation of an electron field, unquote. I believe that there is a field of self. We can enter that field through meditation, for example, and become part of that field and lose our particleness. We become non-dual in the wave state. When the meditation is over, we particleize again and notice that we are in a body that is separate from everyone else. Our parts, especially when they are burdened, forget our field or wave state of connectedness and can make us forget too. As we separate from them and access purer self, we remember our wave state connectedness. Because our particle self is an aspect of a vibrating field, it will resonate with the self in other people and in our parts. As science writer Tam Hunt writes, quote, all things in our universe are constantly in motion, vibrating. Even objects that appear to be stationary are in fact vibrating, oscillating, resonating at various frequencies. Resonance is a type of motion, characterized by oscillation between two states, and ultimately all matter is just vibrations of various underlying fields. An interesting phenomenon occurs when different vibrating things or processes come into proximity. They will often start, after a little time, to vibrate together at the same frequency. They sync up, sometimes in ways that can seem mysterious. This is described today as the phenomenon of spontaneous self-organization, unquote. I find that having those field or wave experiences and then remembering them helps me maintain the kind of non-attached perspective that Buddhists refer to. Not non-attached in a dissociative sense, but something non-reactive and equanimous in the face of life's slings and arrows. Rather than making me care less about what happens in this world, that kind of non-attachment actually helps me to act to improve the world with less concern for my image or lifestyle. I also believe that part of the reason why psychedelics are so useful for depressed people, or those at the end of their lives, is that they help people hold a sense of the wave state and experience firsthand that there is much more beyond this life. We need a balance, however, between spending time in the wave and then bringing that transcendent perspective and energy of self to our parts and the people we encounter. Meditating can be a wonderful complement to the inner work of IFS. I have been collaborating with a couple of teachers of Tibetan Buddhism, Lama John Makransky and Lama Willa Miller, to see how some of their practices enhance the IFS process and how IFS can help them avoid spiritual bypassing and or exiling of parts. I collaborated similarly with Locke Kelly, who's known for his way of helping people quickly get what he calls glimpses of self through his adaptation of a Dzogchen Buddhist meditation. Some have written at length on integrating IFS with Christianity. I believe that the worship of Jesus and other self-led prophets can help people access self and inspire them to acts of altruism, as long as that worship doesn't usurp your part's trust in your own self. Unfortunately, there are religious denominations that do that. My spiritual dawning. My father was a well-known endocrinology physician and researcher, and as such was a scientific atheist. He was from New York, grew up in Brooklyn and Queens, and he was raised by conservative Jews who had immigrated from Hungary as teenagers. My father renounced organized religion as a young man, and he blamed it for many of the world's ills. He always proudly considered himself a Jew, but a secular Jew, not a religious one. I was highly influenced by him. My mother was raised in a Christian household on a wheat farm in Montana, and she converted to Judaism to please my father's parents. She also didn't have strong religious convictions. Since I could never believe in the punitive, adoration-seeking parental God I was exposed to in Judaism and Christianity, I considered myself an atheist and had little interest in anything spiritual. I tried transcendental meditation after college to see if it would help with my anxiety, and indeed it did. Using my mantra, I could leave my troubles behind for 20 minutes, enter a thoroughly enjoyable state, and feel a warm, vibrating energy run through my body. I loved the practice, but eschewed the Hindu mysticism in which it was embedded. I practiced transcendental meditation regularly for years and then stopped, but I retained the memory of the wonderful state I could access. When I first encountered self in my clients, in the early 1980s, as I helped them get their parts to open space inside, I tried unsuccessfully to link the phenomenon to a psychological theory. The prevailing wisdom in developmental psychology and attachment theory was that for someone to have that kind of ego strength, they had to have received good enough parenting as a child. To the contrary, I had clients who'd been tortured daily when they were kids, and yet they'd manifest the same undamaged self. I began to wonder if that self was similar to the place that transcendental meditation had taken me to. I also had some students at the time who were studying various spiritual traditions. One thought the self was like Atman, and another believed it was Buddha nature. That encouraged me to unload my anti-religion legacy burden and search for analogs to self in different spiritual traditions. It turns out that it was everywhere, particularly in the contemplative or esoteric sides of those traditions. Many subscribe to the belief that there is a divine essence inside everyone, and I began to consider that I had stumbled on a way to access that essence in people much more quickly than most of these traditions teach is possible. Most of them held a goal of overcoming the ignorance of your divine nature and then becoming aware of who you really are. I was finding something similar with my clients. As people started to notice and then separate from their parts, they would have a sudden identity shift and would come to realize that they weren't their burdened parts, and instead were the self. It seemed I had inadvertently come across a simple way to achieve what many traditions called becoming awakened. When I say you become awakened by doing this work, I don't mean that you turn into a guru who lives up on a mountain somewhere and dishes out wisdom to visitors. Nor do I mean that you'll be Buddha-like all the time. What I do find is that this simple shift in the sense of who you actually are starts to pervade your life in a number of positive ways. It may not change the actual day-to-day operation of your life enormously, but it's a drastic shift in your sense of groundedness, well-being, and your sense of having a right to be here. For me, that is awakening. The more you become familiar with it, the easier you can detect when you depart from that state. When you're having a quote-unquote part attack, it stops becoming such a big deal because you know it's temporary and that you can unblend from the part and help it out. And even if you can't unblend, you trust that yourself is still there and will return at some point. Many of our troubles come not so much from the part attack itself, but more from our panic about it, because we believe it defines us and won't end. This has been Chapter 6, Healing and Transformation from No Bad Parts, Healing Trauma and Restoring Wholeness with the Internal Family Systems Model. It was written by Richard C. Schwartz, PhD, read by Naomi Kirst-Schultz. Thanks for reading with me.